For myself personally, as well as being an instructor and also a author for SANS, I also look after the digital forensics and incident response team in Asia Pacific for Ankura. So Matt and I both spend our day jobs doing incident response and threat hunting as well, and working with clients as well that are trying to do the same type of thing in their organization, as well as trying to educate people around that as well. Now, if there are any questions that kind of come up throughout the session today, there is a Slack channel, and I'll give you the link for that in a moment. But there is a general discussion channel in there as well, where you can start to chat amongst yourselves and also with some of the presenters today as well. In doing some of that, though, just a reminder to be respectful of everyone that is in there. It's important that this is an open community to share ideas and to share concepts with everyone. So we ask everyone to be respectful of everyone else that is there, and regardless of whether that's on Slack or whether that is inside of any of the chat in Zoom as well. So as I mentioned, there is a dedicated Slack instance for today's session. And the idea behind this is so that you can connect with some of our sponsors that are here that are going to talk to you as well today. And also so you can connect with Matt and myself and ask questions throughout this session. So by all means, jump onto that Slack channel and join the community and join the discussion there. We really welcome questions throughout. What we'll do is if you think of a question and you want to ask it, make sure you put it into that Slack channel. You can put it into Zoom as well if you're having issues with Slack, and we'll also moderate out of there as well. And what we'll try to do is we'll pause at the end of the sections as we kind of go through today, and then we'll try to answer questions as we kind of hit those sections, or if there's kind of complicated or long questions, we'll try to answer those in the Slack room as well. With that, I'll hand over to my co-author on the paper this year, Matt, to run us through a little bit of the agenda today and some of the starting statistics for our survey.
Thank you very much, Josh. It was a pleasure writing the report again with you. So today's webcast is slightly different than you might be used to from the last few years. So we're going to present the numbers first. After that, we go through the different vendors, which is going to be interesting because you got another chance to ask questions, right? So that's going to be like a panel discussion for which we have another half hour. So totally different format, but it gives you more ability to ask us questions, to ask the vendors questions. So that's going to be very interesting what comes out of that. Josh, if you could just forward the slide, that would be great. Thank you very much. The demographics this year have been very interesting, also compared to the other years. As Josh mentioned, we've been doing that for quite a few years now, and we're always looking at very similar demographics. But this year is very interesting because the amount of large companies that we have in our respondent pool is quite big. So the small companies with up to 1,000 people, they make up the majority. That's always the same because they're just more smaller companies than bigger companies. So I think that's very clear. But this time, the second largest group is people from very large organizations. And that is something you have to keep in mind when looking at the numbers, because very often a lot of budget in the security translates to potentially a better chance to have good threat hunting in your organization and be a little bit more mature when it comes to that. It's a lot about budget. Secondly, that's very interesting. Banking and finance is the #1 industry that we have represented here. So it's also an industry that's quite critical when it comes to cyber breaches. So that might also speak for a pool of respondents that have quite some maturity in threat hunting. What's nice to see, because it kept changing over the last few years, is the geographic distribution. So we usually ask that in two different stages. So one stage is, okay, where is your headquarters? And second is, where are your operational organizations around the world? And as you can see in here, it's pretty evenly split. So we always have around about 80 organizations in North America, with about 80 in Europe. So that is very good. Also in the Middle East, we have a few organizations. We have in Asia a few organizations, also Australia. So it's very well distributed. So in when we go back a few years, it was more US centric, obviously, and now it's growing bigger. And that, I think, makes a lot of sense and also adds to the quality of the data that we got in here. The other thing is this time we have a very large group of people really doing the job, right? Like security operations, security analysts, rather than the management side, because obviously the management perspective on things might be a little bit different than a technical one. So based on that data, you can expect that especially the more technically focused questions might be answered from the trenches rather than from the management position. So that's also very interesting. And with that, I hand over to Josh again. Let's look into the numbers. We don't have that much time.
Thank you. So what we're going to try and do is give you a little bit of a flavor of what we saw in the overall numbers. This is not a full in-depth look at the overall report. We highly encourage you to go and download that and have a read through that in a lot more detail. Some of the key findings that we saw this year is that a little over 50% of organizations consider threat hunting in a state of still maturing, and I'm going to talk more about some of those numbers in a moment. One of the barriers that we are seeing in terms of organizations, in terms of what they need to do better threat hunting, is sort of this large pool of just under 70% of organizations saying that they see a lack of training or skilled staff to be able to do threat hunting. And again, we'll actually look at this a little bit today and kind of potentially talk about why that might be a bit of an issue as well. We're seeing 62% of our respondents use internally developed tools. And then we're seeing just under 50% of our respondents seeking to sort of extend their threat hunting capabilities into the cloud, which really isn't a big surprise. It's interesting that it's kind of taken until this year for that really to get teased out in a lot of the results that we're seeing. But it's interesting to see that just under half of respondents are looking to start to do more threat hunting into cloud environments, which is probably a sign of the times of what we're seeing organizations do as well. We're seeing a quarter of organizations are basically starting to outsource their threat hunting. Again, an interesting question we've asked over a number of years. So again, we start to look at some of that as well. We're seeing 68% of organizations measuring their threat hunting have seen an increase of between 25 to 75% in the overall security posture in their organization. Now, we're actually going to show those statistics on the screen, so that will hopefully make a bit more sense as we kind of get to that just towards the end of Matt and my section. But it is interesting that we are seeing organizations really see an increase in the return of what they are doing as part of threat hunting. And that's important to be able to not only measure that, but also be able to show some of that back as well. So we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. And the last one there is we're seeing nearly half of organizations that threat hunt have seen an improvement in the accuracy of their threat detections, which basically is meaning that they're seeing far fewer false positives. Now, as someone who helps organizations build SOCs, as someone who has worked inside of organizations who have built a SOC to start with or run internal threat detection teams, getting those threat detections to be more accurate with less false positives is a continual task. So it's interesting to see that threat hunting is seeing a decrease in false positives and starting to see more accurate threat detections. And we'll talk briefly about that, but we do go into more detail inside of the report itself as to why that might be more the case. So moving on, talking a little bit about maturity of threat hunting. Now, as Matt mentioned, we've actually been authoring the report now since 2020. So we've been doing this for 3 years, including this year. And what we've also tried to do is start to look at some of the differences between those years. So you'll see that we're seeing just over half of the organizations say that they are still in that maturing phase of threat hunting inside an organization. And you'll see the numbers have moved a little bit from the last year's results. So you'll see that people don't necessarily think that they're in that mature stage so much anymore, and that they're starting to see that they're in that more maturing stage as well. It's kind of grown quite significantly since last year's results. Now, one of the reasons behind that could be that organizations are starting to understand that threat hunting is kind of this ever-evolving skill set inside of an organization, or this ever-evolving task in an organization. as our threat actors evolve, so do our techniques for doing threat hunting and for trying to catch those adversaries inside the environment as well. So that's likely why we're starting to see some of those results shift a little bit into more of that maturing stage. Of course, it is hard. We obviously don't have the exact same people filling out the results or filling out the questions every year. So there could be a little bit of a shift in the spread, as Matt kind of mentioned a moment ago, that we're seeing a better spread across the globe as well, which might be starting to see a more accurate picture of that. So we also ask, what are some of the barriers that organizations are seeing when it comes to doing threat hunting? If they're saying they're still in that maturing stage, or they're still trying to build out threat hunting, what are some of the barriers that would push them further ahead? And again, this is that statistic around that we've seen about 68% of organizations say that skilled staff and sort of lack of training or headcount associated with that is really the biggest barrier that they're seeing there. And that kind of half explains I guess, sort of the second, third, and fourth result there, which are almost kind of very closely tied together in terms of the results from them. But when you look at things like a lack of defined processes or budget constraints or limitations on tools and technology, that kind of makes sense. If you don't have skilled people who know what tools to acquire or know what tools are needed to do threat hunting, it would make sense that they are struggling to find tools, or it would make sense that they're struggling to write a defined process if there aren't skilled staff who know how to do threat hunting inside of an organization. Then from there, we also started to look at specific tools, and I'll hand back to Matt for that one.
Yeah, thanks. Tool part is usually my part there. And as Josh mentioned, we've been doing that for 3 years, and we've been trying to track how it developed over the years. That comes with a few upsides, but also with downsides. The upsides are clearly seen trends, but the downside is we cannot change some of the questions too much, because then we can't compare them any longer. And this is one of the questions where we might have some reasons to change a few things, but on the other hand, we would lose the trend immediately. Just to go into that a slight bit here, these have been the categories for the last 3 years as well. So, and we keep it like that. We were always asking from a tool perspective what people are currently using. So obviously it can be a combination of all of the tools if you want, or a few of these tools. That is important to understand. No one usually uses just one tool to do these things. And secondly, we also ask what was added to their portfolio in the last 24 months, because that is also interesting to understand some sort of a trend in there. So our categories here are artificial intelligence and machine learning, specifically for hunting in that regard. Also the in-house developed tools, I'll get to that in a moment. Open source tools, so it's something that someone developed, but it's not necessarily in-house only. Then hunting platforms that are specialized for hunting. And the majority of people usually responds to the next category, which is automated alerting tools, because they just have that anyhow, right? And that includes SIMs, obviously, but also IDS and IPS. And what I have to clearly say, because we had quite a few discussions on that, that also includes network-based detection mechanism, right? So that's not just for endpoints, that's for everything. Same goes for a SIM, because it depends on what data you put in there, right? And where that is coming from. Also, we have endpoint detection and response there, obviously, because it gives us visibility on the endpoint. And then we have the threat intelligence part here, where it's about getting the threat intelligence into action, because that requires you, especially if you do hypothesis-based hunting, that requires you to have a good feel about how that attacker that you probably faced with works. Okay, so looking at the pure numbers, I already pointed out that the very classical tools that most organizations will have the majority in here. There's still growth, as you can see, because apparently 30% of our respondents only added that in the last 24 months, or at least some of the tools, which is something that we do see also, especially in mid-sized companies and smaller companies in my day job. So they just start to keep adding additional tools like EDRs. So they probably come from SIM, go to EDR, and similar stories happen all the time. Another noteworthy thing is that we have 62.4, so almost like 2/3 of the respondents who use customly made tools, which is something I personally also like to do from a analyst perspective. From a management perspective, I see in my teams that it gets harder and harder to sort of um, well, own the tools, because usually those tools are assigned to a single person, to a small group of people. When you lose those people, no one can use them any longer, right? Because usually they are only very scarcely documented. So having those tools can, well, get you in a very bad spot. On the other hand, it also adds very much to your sophistication if they're done right. So, every corporation is different. So in that regard, there is no one size fits it all. So you can augment where other tools leave some spots open, but try to freeze that kind of software to your organization. Don't bind it to a single person. That will come out bad. What surprised me a little bit is, as you can see in the artificial intelligence and machine learning part, we have a saturation of about 50%, right? Half of the organizations that responded have something like that. But at the same time, it's at the smallest percentage when it comes to growth over the last 24 months. So apparently there is still room to grow compared to other tools, but at the same time, currently it's not working out too well. So that means that, well, either organizations that sell those tools are not transporting very well what their benefit is, or the customers don't really understand it at this point, or there's still some room to improve. We can't tell based on the numbers which one it is, because, and that is not in the slides, but it's in the report, the satisfaction level for these tools is as high as for other categories in here. So that's important to understand. So those are just the key takeaways, but keep one thing in mind, and we keep having that in our survey. A fool with a tool is still a fool, right? So you need the right people to operate that. Otherwise, well, it's probably not very valuable to you. So Josh, that would be
correct. I couldn't agree more. There's no point having a really good tool if you're not quite sure how to actually operate it or use it. All right. So the other thing that we focused on this year for the first time was more detail around what methodologies organizations were using to actually go and conduct threat hunting. Now, this is actually, when we looked at results from previous years, we realized that this is actually a pretty key component to a lot of the other questions that we actually asked. Like, understanding how mature you are obviously kind of leads into whether you have any type of methodology behind that, or understanding how you're measuring success in threat hunting often relates to whether you have some type of methodology that you're actually measuring that success against. So this year we actually asked people quite explicitly, all right, like, are you doing some type of, or do you have some type of methodology related to how you're doing threat hunting in an organization? Surprisingly, we're seeing 3/4 of people who actually say they have some type of methodology inside their organization, which is amazing. I mean, it was a little surprising to see the number was so high, but it was really good to see that people had thought about this and thought about actually putting something on paper around what they're doing from the perspective of threat hunting. Now, we actually spend quite a lot of time talking about this in the paper, so I recommend you go and take a bit of a look at it. One thing that we also asked as well, and it's probably something that we may actually try to explore in future years, is around what methodologies people are actually using as well, which is kind of a harder thing to ask in a survey form. Now, we did ask that question in sort of a free text form, which meant that we had a huge wide variety of different responses. So we kind of had to categorize some of them together. But a lot of them vary from, and again, we kind of picked out 4 in the paper, which we talked about, that we could kind of categorize things into. But we try to look at those 4 different types of methodologies that people are using, or that we could group things into, and the benefits of those and the downsides to those as well, just to help people kind of enhance their threat hunting as they go through the environment. Now, it's one thing to understand whether people have a methodology or not, but it's also important to know that that methodology hasn't been written and stuck on the shelf sort of 3 years ago and never looked at again. So the other thing that we asked as well this time around was, how often do you review or make changes to your threat hunting methodology? And as we kind of go back to what I mentioned at the start, like, threat actors actively change how they move in the environment and actively change what they do. So we need to adapt along with doing that as well. And it's important that our threat hunting methodologies also adapt as well to match that. So we asked some detail around how often people review or make changes to it. So we've seen some people who say sort of whenever needed. Again, probably because it's the first time we've asked this question, it could be something we could drill down into a little bit further, given how large those results were. But after that, we're kind of seeing a bit of a split between monthly, quarterly, and annually. Now, the reality is reviewing your threat hunting methodology probably doesn't need to be done monthly. It probably doesn't need to occur that fast if it's kind of a methodology that's written relatively robustly. But it is something that is worth someone reviewing at least like once a quarter or maybe twice a year, just to make sure that what is inside that methodology still matches and fits with the tools and the techniques and what it is that your sort of mission is from that threat hunting perspective as well. And with that, I'll hand back over to Matt to talk a little bit about people in threat hunting.
Yeah, and I think that's it's not just people, it's tools again, right? So the thing is, the development that we see here is very clear. And that was what we were unsure about because, staffing is difficult, we know that, but also budgets are tight, especially after COVID and everything. But you can see that the trend is going up very much. So when you look at staffing, more than 2/3 of the organizations are gonna grow their, or about 2/3 are gonna grow their threat hunting operations, right? People-wise, and that's interesting because I have no clue where these people should be coming from at this point. So if everyone is in a position where you need to hire people, good luck with that. It's not fun right now. So we cannot even train them fast enough to onboard this many people. But there's a second thing in here, and that's regarding tools. As you can see, from the spending perspective, almost 30% tend or want to spend more money into tools, right? And a quarter more money. So that could be a significant number there. So I guess it's a good time to come out with a good tool, to tune your tool, to be more supportive for threat hunting, because if what the respondent said is right, there is budget around that can be spent on these tools. But how we get around the people limitation, I do not have a clue, really. That's a real problem. So I think we need to push on.
Nice. All right, so the other thing that we often ask each year is also around measuring success with threat hunting. There's obviously an importance around making sure that what you're doing actually has some sort of benefit to an organization. It's not just doing it for the fun of it. So again, we asked a question around whether people are doing any type of formal measuring of success or the effectiveness of threat hunting in an organization. It's interesting here that we only sort of see 43% of people say that they are doing some sort of formal measuring. I mean, when you consider that 75% say that they have some type of methodology, it does mean that they should really be able to measure their success against the methodology that they've written, or at least have some of that documented in that methodology as well. So probably another interesting place that we might dive into in further years. But the measurement of success has been a question we've asked as co-authors for the last 3 years. So of those who said yes, they do some type of formal measuring of success, we then actually started to ask them, all right, well, how much improvement are you seeing to the overall security posture inside of your organization? And it's been an interesting shift because we asked the same type of question last year. We can actually graph these together this time around to see this. Now, thankfully, we're seeing a significant amount of people who are seeing some type of improvement in their security posture for their organization this year. Overall, that actually indicates that we're actually seeing 85% of respondents see some type of improved success or improvement the security posture of their organization. So that's a really good outcome that we're seeing as part of it, and also really goes to show that that doing threat hunting can really have an impact in an organization. So it's really interesting and really nice to see that as well. It's also kind of interesting. It's kind of fair that we also show the negative side of the results as well. Like we need to be transparent in the findings that we have as part of it. But we do see that 10% of respondents say that they saw no change, which is kind of interesting. Again, might be interesting in future years to understand why that is more the case. But again, this could be part of an issue between knowing exactly how to measure that correctly. Again, with the disparity between how many people are measuring success and how many people have a methodology, maybe we're seeing some issues with that. And then also 5% of respondents say that they saw a negative impact on the overall organization security posture. Although I do kind of say that looking at the results here, in that we are seeing that number that sees some sort of negative impact is actually decreasing year on year. And that may be that the measurement of what they're doing, or maybe they're improving over time slowly, which is actually moving them from that sort of negative result or no result over to actually seeing a positive result on the organization as well. So either way, it's still a good news story. We are seeing things move slowly to the right, which is what we want to see here. And also the fact that 85% of organizations that are measuring threat hunting are seeing some success is a brilliant statistic, sort of either way that you look at it as well. The other thing we started to ask this year, in a little bit more of a formal way, is around what success you're actually seeing as part of this. So one of those big successes that we're seeing, where people see that significant success in their organization, is around doing things like reducing the attack surface, or doing things like hardening network devices or hardening endpoints as well, which would make complete sense when you're doing threat hunting. Often you might not only uncover bad things that are going on inside the organization, but also potentially misconfigurations or misuse of technology as well, that kind of gets scooped up as part of the threat hunting that you're doing, and then hopefully gets cleaned up or handed off to teams to start to look at that as well. The other one that we mentioned as well at the top there around some of the key findings is more accurate detections and fewer false positives. Always a significant benefit. I cannot see any SOC analysts anywhere complaining that they're getting more accurate detections. So that is always a good thing. Having your operational staff focus on actual things that are true positives that need to be investigated is a huge win for organizations as well. So it's really good to kind of see those measurements of success and where people are seeing success inside of their organization as well. And again, we talk more about this in the report in a bit more detail. So with that, I'll hand over to Matt to kind of talk about some of the key takeaways. And what I might do, Matt, while you're running through this, I might start to look through the discussion channel and start to kind of check out any questions that we can kind of raise there and go through.
You're second to that. I already responded to most of the questions.
Oh, perfect.
So far.
I'm assuming that means you've left me all the hard ones to look after.
No, but you could have like a different opinion on things. So that's
really nice.
Interesting as well. So I've got about 1 minute for the key takeaways here. So just a few factors. I'm looking at the 3 Ps here because, funny enough, this is exactly where we see our trends here. So first of all, we see the people trend. So we need more hunting teams. That's a very clear trend, as you saw in my last slide. So a lot of people are going to be hired if they are available. Second is process. So 75% claim to have some form of methodology, which I, sort of put into the process part because I think it works out that way. And the third thing is product. So organizations already invested in tools, but also keep investing in tools. So we have all 3 of the P's here. If you align all of these, the chances for success are quite big. We got another set of questions in there. It's in the report, but not so much in the slides. We also asked how the tools influence how organizations hunt, and that is something that does happen. So that means that people get a tool thrown at them and they need to work with that. If you have to do that, be sure to check out that you form whatever you want to get out of the infrastructure first. So be sure what you want to have first, and then check out how to get it with the tool. If the tool doesn't get it for you, well, then probably it's the wrong tool. But don't do it in that way that you say, okay, the tool can do this and that. There's that auto hunt button and it does all the hunting for me. That is usually where you should get suspicious, right? I mean, then you're probably not in the hunting space anymore.